Hello, my name is Edmund Demarche. I am the executive editor at the Trends Journal magazine. I am pleased to introduce to you Doug Bandow. He is a senior fellow at the CATO Institute. Doug, thank you for joining me today to discuss Ukraine.
Happy to be on.
My first question, I guess we'll go right to it. Yesterday, Joseph Borrell comes out from the EU and he says, the West is essentially losing the narrative battle in this conflict in Ukraine. I was curious to see if you had any kind of opinion on that comment. How would the West be losing that battle?
Well, I assume he's thinking in terms of the global South, that while the US, European Union countries, and several of the more industrialized democratic states of Asia have all come together pretty strongly to criticize Russia, to sanction Russia, and to some degree, depending on the country, give aid to Ukraine. We don't see that from China or Indonesia or India or Brazil or Nigeria or South Africa. Yeah, I think that there's that sense that while the US and Europe thought that they were going to basically be able to march around the world and have everyone behind them, they found pretty dramatically that that's not the case. So in that sense, I suppose they think they're losing the narrative. I'm not sure that that's the right way to look at it, as in, I think most of those countries recognize that Russia is by far in the wrong, that there is no justification for, kind of grotesque aggression and everything that's happened. But the other countries have other things on their mind. Part of that's, they don't give the same credibility to the West that the West gives to itself, and part of it has to be its own interests. These are poorer countries. There's a lot going on that I think is broader than a narrative that's not being sold.
Got it. And also they're dependent as far as energy goes on Russia. If they came out against Russia, they saw what happened with Poland. Russia will just cut you off.
And in a world where energy prices are rising, inflation is rising, the fact they can get a better deal out of Russia on oil is something which, look, the Indians are really doing that, a lot of Indian purchases. It's hard to criticize them. And I understand why we wish they would not do that. On the other hand, if you're a relatively poor country, you're facing all these economic challenges, you have political problems at home, it's easy to sit in Washington or Brussels and judge, what the politicians are doing in Jakarta or in Delhi or somewhere else.
I read recently, you wrote for the Cato Institute, they tweeted out, I think it was yesterday, and I thought this was very interesting what you wrote. You said, Kiev is an independent state, free to make its own decisions. However, it's not entitled to dictate Allied policy. Do you care to talk to me what you meant by that and why you think that there's kind of this confusion there?
Well, it comes in the context of American officials, our Deputy Secretary of State, as well as some European officials who've talked in terms of Ukraine will make the decision on when it wants to make peace. Ukraine will make the decision on what terms it wants to make peace, and we will support them, kind of leaving it in those terms. And my reaction is, of course, only Kyiv can make this decision. That has to be up to them. They have to decide. The Ukrainians will have to decide what they're willing to fight for, what the cost is, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that the proper US response is whatever Kyiv wants. My kind of snarky take was that if President Zelensky woke up tomorrow and decided that he wanted to conquer Moscow and raise St. Petersburg and hold the rest of the country hostage till he got reparations, would the US support that? And I would say that's probably not the best strategy. And, if Ukraine wants to try it, go ahead. But frankly, I wouldn't underwrite it. So my point simply is that Allied states have to make these decisions with their own citizens' interests in mind, which means they don't hand out blank checks. And if you want a famous blank check, it's World War I. It's Wilhelmine Germany supporting Austro-Hungary, essentially saying, go after the Serbs, get it done real quick. And well, they did. And lo and behold, look what happened. So my comment there was to say, slow this down. The Ukrainians are entitled to make their own decisions, but that doesn't mean Western countries give up independent agency in what their policy is going to be.
Are these conversations happening right now between diplomats from the US and Ukraine? Are they having these things like, hey, don't push it too far? I know when we were sending advanced rockets to Ukraine, that was a hot topic, was something we're afraid they could fire this into Russia. Are these conversations that they're having right now, like, we're willing to help you up until this point, don't go over the border of Ukraine? Would that be something they're discussing right now, you think?
It's certainly possible, but it's very hard to know. I mean, publicly, and I think I understand why both the US and Europeans want to present a united front in support of Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has been faced with this atrocious aggression. You know, it would be good for Ukraine to be able to rebuff that, to turn the Russians back. One would like to see Ukraine succeed here. You know, so there's I think, a real impetus to try to suggest we are united behind Ukraine. And these private conversations, if they're occurring, they're keeping private, which what worries me is that what you say publicly does matter. So that and that's where I think it's important, especially to communicate to Russia, that we are interested in peace. I mean, so if there's a peace deal, we support that. That one wants to provide that as an option, as opposed to make it seem that this will only be settled on the battlefield, no matter how long it takes. It's not clear to me that Ukraine wins that. I mean, and I think, and the cost, I mean, I think is potentially horrific. So that's something where, again, Ukraine will have to make that final decision, but the allies need to decide what they are prepared to push, because an endless war is not in America's interest. I mean, I worry about escalation. I worry about a lot of things that could come out of this very badly.
Is New York, for example, just released a new nuclear war video on what would happen if a bomb went off in dead center Manhattan. So obviously, you know, governments are considering escalation here. I mean, it's no secret that Ukraine's on fire right now, and they're coming out with these kind of videos. I was thinking, as far as Zelensky goes, you gave him credit in one of your articles for being a leader and staying there, staying in the fight. He didn't flee the country. He's there to support his people. So and it's hard to be anything less than admire the Ukrainians fighting right now. So when they come out and they say, you know what, we already fought, we already bled on the battlefields here. We don't want to cede any land to Russia. We're going to fight until we get every inch back. Now, that's a great battle cry, and one can understand why they would say that. But is that a pragmatic approach for Zelensky to continue to take, in your opinion?
Look, I mean, again, only Ukrainians can decide what price they're willing to pay, but it strikes me they could pay a very, very high price. I mean, Russia at the moment seems to be doing reasonably well in the Donbass. I mean, because, you know, and I think one of the problems for Americans has been that, given the support for Ukraine, there's a tendency to take everything Ukraine says and accept it, and dismiss anything that Russia says. And my worry is that on the battlefield, I think that it's a bit more even. And especially if we look at casualty numbers, and one of the questions we have is, how much of Ukraine's well-trained army has been destroyed or incapacitated? How much is left? I mean, so is it realistic to be talking about offensives? And especially when one starts throwing in issues of taking Crimea. I mean, you know, so to me, that's the real danger. Now, I understand. Look, I look back at World War I. I mean, nobody in Europe thought they were going to get what they got. They all thought it was going to be a quick victory. And you go to 1916 trench warfare, and at that point, everybody says, we've bled too much, we have to win. And what it meant was 2 more years of bleeding. I mean, horrendous, millions. So to me, that's the danger, is that you understand the emotion. And I said in my article, I mean, I think Zelensky's been quite courageous, and he mattered. I mean, the fact that he stayed really, I think, was very important in galvanizing the resistance. And, you know, the Ukrainians deserve to win this. I mean, they should not have been attacked. There's just no justification for that. But they also have to decide what price they're prepared to pay. And where, you know, the World Bank says the economy is going to be cut in half. I look at cities that have been reduced to rubble. I see casualty estimates, 200 to 500 dead a day. Ukraine, and that suggests 1,000 wounded more. I mean, kind of I mean, to me, that's where one has to be prepared to step back. It's the fallacy of the sunk cost. What you have spent up till now tells you nothing about the future. That is, it's gone. So the question is the cost of whatever the future action worth the benefit you're getting? Very hard to do that and step away. But to me, that's what one has got to, and the US has done that. I mean, in Afghanistan, people would say, oh, we can't, everybody, so many have died. And my reaction was, no, the way you honor those who are dead is you don't have more die. I mean, you don't just do this endlessly because you've lost in the past. You've got to make a decision for the future. And to me, that's what Ukrainians have got to do. And it will not be easy. I mean, who can blame Ukrainians for being angry and horrified? I mean, all the emotions that would be there, I recognize.
Tell me, in your opinion, what did we see so far as the strength of Russia's military? In the beginning of the war, there were media reports saying they were in disarray. Ukraine could very well push them back and this war could be over. And now we have Putin. He seems very deliberate in not calling this a war or even an invasion. He's been very deliberate in being clear that Russia doesn't consider this a war. It's a conflict. It's a special military operation. Obviously, Finland and Sweden, other countries are very concerned about the strength of Russia. Have we not seen the strength, in your opinion, of Russia's military in Ukraine? Is this something that's kind of almost like a side military operation that we're not seeing even close to the real true strength, even just of conventional Russian forces?
Well, I think we're seeing very much their peacetime conventional strength in a way. They have not engaged in mass mobilization. But it certainly would appear to me they've used much of their active duty forces that they have without mobilization. And that's significant. And I think that part of what happened was strategic. They thought they were going to roll over Kyiv. So, I mean, you just kind of to some degree it happened in the American Civil War. Everybody thought, oh, there'll be one little battle and the other side's going to run away. And suddenly, they eventually found where they're losing 50,000 people in a battle. I mean, the Battle of Gettysburg. That they wouldn't have imagined that. I think to some degree that seemed to be what hit the Russians. They, unfortunately, Putin, from his standpoint, believed, kind of the story they told themselves about what Kyiv was like and the loyalty of people, etc. And I think, and part of it, I think, was that they did have some deficiencies that they'd missed in terms of, everything from tire quality to a lot of other stuff, logistics and things. It looks to me like they did what militaries usually do, which is when you have that kind of a screw up, you do retrench and you start weeding out the people who are incompetent. And apparently one of the big things that Putin did is he put one person in charge overall to make sure that person had the authority to get things done, to bring everybody. Before, apparently, there were multiple commands and whatnot. So, and it looks to me like they also went back to their strength, the use of artillery, that they understood Ukrainian soldiers were in fact good and had good equipment and were capable. And they realized their huge advantage was artillery, and they've used it, it appears, to great effect. It strikes me that what we've seen tells me that even a mobilized Russia is not capable of conquering Europe. I mean, I just don't think that can happen. Now, I think that is something that we can feel comfortable with. And I've never thought there's much evidence that they want to. I mean, I do think Ukraine is a special case for lots of reasons, some of which were debated early on, but I think are generally true, that it mattered in a number of ways, security and historically, in a way that I just don't think that Putin cares much about Finland, and certainly not Sweden. I don't think he cares about Macedonia. It just strikes me these are not. I mean, the idea that he'd want to conquer Germany is just kind of beyond, whatnot. But I think that what we've seen is that the Russian military is capable, so we shouldn't underestimate it. I think that its ability to launch, a continental-wide offensive, I just think that's not there. What I think we should do is not underestimate what it would do on the defensive, fighting for Mother Russia, on the defensive, using, full mobilization, especially with nuclear weapons. And that's why I think we want to be very careful about expansion of the war, escalation, that we could move to another realm that could be much more dangerous. So we don't want to dismiss Russian military power.
What kind of a threat is Russia's new formed alliance with China? China sees NATO becoming a lot more apparent in their efforts in the Pacific. Obviously, there's a natural relationship between China and Russia, as NATO is this major aggressor, at least as far as their opinion goes. What kind of threat is a Russia-China combination for the world?
Well, I don't think it's so much a military threat. That is, I don't think they're sitting around saying we're going to take over the world. I just don't think there's that interest. I think Russia recognizes that it is a major regional power with some international reach, and it wants what America has. It wants to have its sphere of influence, and that's its focus. And I think in many ways China is the same way. That China has global ambitions that I think are primarily economic and to some degree diplomatic. I think militarily it's much more its neighborhood, they would say, I think, more the Asia Pacific, if you want to say Indo-Pacific, toss it in, but I think primarily Asia Pacific. And Taiwan is the big touchstone. But the other, they're in all the other islands and stuff. I don't think they want to take over Japan, but they do believe the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands are theirs. But I don't see them sitting down as kind of a united military attack. I think that it's important because they offer each other diplomatic support. They can offer economic support, that they certainly can work. And I think over the long term, they're going to work together, not only alone, but India and others want to diminish the role of the dollar. No one likes to be sanctioned. The Chinese have seen the power of sanctions. Now, to some degree, they backfire, but I think China is much more integrated into the international community. It doesn't want to face major economic losses. So there's stuff they're going to work on, but it strikes me that this is an alliance. We need to take this into. I've long argued, and it's kind of hard now. that we should be trying to find a way to have a modus vivendi with Russia, to not push it towards China. It's not so much pull them away. That gets that is not the easiest, but to stop pushing them together. But I think that's maybe we could do that with China, but we should look at that as how do we try to prevent them from viewing each other as the best option. I just do not take NATO seriously as a Pacific power. Tell me which European country is going to build up a blue water navy, an expeditionary army with an air force to boot, and send it to the Pacific. The British have, I think, 161 tanks or something.
Yeah. They're probably the closest. They're probably the closest to that. I would say the UK. I would say
the UK and France at least have real navies, but they're not capable of taking on the China. We'd be happy to have a few ships, but they will not change the balance. And they don't have. If you want Britain to help in Europe, it needs more than a couple hundred tanks. You just kind of and Germany. I'm just very skeptical of all this. I think the moment things ease up and there's at least halfway peace, the Germans are going to say, that was, we're having other things. We'll get to that. Trust us, we'll eventually get there. I think this is one where the Chinese are worrying about something without much there. There's an old line of there's no there. They talk about it. I do think that Europeans could work with, say, South Korea, Japan on issues like cybersecurity. I think the question of economic cooperation, especially where China's been going after Lithuania, China's gone after Australia, China's gone after South Korea economically. Well, how to bring the United Western Alliance, and however you want to refer to it, together there, I think, but I'd probably work more through the EU than the NATO through that. But I think that looking at NATO as a Pacific power is just, I want the Europeans to defend Europe. The U.S. is sending more forces. The U.S. is bankrupt. U.S. debt to GDP is 100%. We're approaching the record set in 1946 after World War II. It was 106%. Congressional Budget Office tells us it could be 200% by 2050. Interest rates are going up, and that means interest payments are going up. We can have hundreds of billions of dollars of federal interest payments. That comes off the top before we get to anything else. Aging population. people don't want to give up Medicare and Social Security for defending Europe. I mean, I just, I mean, Europeans have got to do more, and forget China. I mean, you know, that's not their military. They need to do enough to make sure they feel comfortable, and countries at the edge like Poland and the Baltics feel comfortable in Europe. If they ever get there, then I welcome them to go off into the Pacific. But until then, I'd say, no, no, do Europe. That's your job.
I have a few more questions if you could indulge me on
Sure.
these. I know you worked inside the Reagan White House and you knew Ronald Reagan personally. I'd be amiss to not ask you, what do you think Ronald Reagan would do if he was all of a sudden just put into the White House right now? And prime Ronald Reagan, how do you think he would handle this situation?
Oh boy. You know, I mean, one of the problems, of course, the situation we have now, there's so much that helped cause it. So he would have loved to have been around earlier to try to prevent some of the things that got us where we're at. Um, I mean, I think he would be very concerned on the nuclear issue. I think he proved that he understands how dangerous this could go. And to me, and I think that you would hear more of that about peace from him, knowing that if you have the US and Russia going at it, I mean, these are two major conventional powers with nuclear weapons. We've never had a full-on conventional war between nuclear powers. I mean, the closest we came would be India and Pakistan when there were terrorist attacks on Bombay and whatnot, where India at that point had nuclear weapons. They fought 3 times before, but they didn't have nukes at that time. I mean, the point is we're in this uncharted territory. And the same thing with China is I think he would recognize, because he really learned early in his presidency that the Soviets were very nervous, thought we might attack them and thought we might use nukes against them. And he understood at that point how close we were potentially to Armageddon. So I think that would be one thing that he would be out there pushing harder to say, we've got to get this settled. And exactly how he'd verbalize it, and I think a lot of it would be private. I think he'd want to have private communication with the Russians. I think he learned with Gorbachev how, you know, again, how important that is. I mean, he wanted to do it under Brezhnev and company. His complaint was they kept dying on him. You know, it was hard to establish a relationship because, you know, Brezhnev dies and then Chernenko dies and then Andropov dies. And he finally got Gorbachev and, you know, they could do business. So I think that would be one part of it. I think he'd be pushing harder for the Europeans to really do a lot more. I mean, I do think that he'd be kind of, I mean, this would be 40 years on, and I think his reaction would be kind of what have you guys been doing the last 40 years? That, I mean, you know, excuse me, you know, I mean, the Soviet Union disappears, Warsaw Pact disappears, and why are you guys still dependent? I think that would be an issue for him. He'd certainly, well, I mean, he'd take a tough stand. He believed in freedom. He'd certainly support Ukraine, but I don't think militarily. Again, I don't think he'd go to war over it, but he would certainly stand there. I mean, because he very much wanted to see Europe liberated. You know, and I mean that even though the wall fell after his time in office, I mean, for him that kind of the culmination of a vision. I mean, you know, where he stood and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I mean, that encapsulated it. He'd look at the economic side. And he'd realize you got to get that fixed. That if you want to maintain a strong military, you've got to have a strong economy. I think he'd make major effort in that, and he'd be very disturbed by the disunity. And I think he'd especially be worried about the Republican Party. This is a man who would, I mean, people have compared Reagan and Trump, and they simply aren't the same. That Reagan had a very different. I mean, Reagan worked with Democrats. Reagan never vilified people, never made fun. I mean, he would find this a very difficult, and he would, I think, be making major efforts to find a way to bring folks together. But again, if America wants to be powerful abroad, it's got to be together at home.
Was Russia a missed opportunity back in the early 90s? I forget what exact year. At least Vladimir Putin said that he reached out to Bill Clinton about Russia actually joining NATO. And I know Russia felt slighted after the Cold War. They felt that the U.S. didn't really respect them. And how much, and this is the last question. I know this can go on for an hour, and this is historic. But you know, how much were there blunders earlier on that this could have been prevented from decades ago? Is that kind of a fair assessment that we missed some opportunities with Russia in the early 90s even, that could have at least embraced them a little bit more than we did as far as the US?
Yeah, look, the past is unknowable, but I think that there's a lot of reason to believe that we blew it. And while nothing was guaranteed, we made it very hard to have a good outcome. I mean, I encourage, John Mearsheimer has a famous essay that's out on YouTube, and it's worth watching. Now, you can quibble with John on a number of things. I mean, I know John, he's a noted realist, but he strikes me, he presents, I think, a story of why Russia thought, its security was at stake and its interests were dismissed. And I think there is an awful lot to that. I mean, look, American policymakers want to dismiss all that. I mean, American policymakers take responsibility for nothing. I mean, Iraq war happens, no WMDs, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis are dead, and not a single American policymaker that I know of has ever been held accountable. Hundreds of thousands of people died. I mean, I find this shocking, outrageous, and the people, they kind of go on to hire.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and to me, so when you hear American policymakers dismiss that Putin had sent things and other stuff, it's like, no, remember what they did on Iraq, which is kind of dismissed the whole thing and walked away and nothing. I mean, Putin gave a speech to the Bundestag in Germany. I think it was like 91. It's worth reading. It was very conciliatory. He talked about how, of course, Russia recognized there was a close US-European relationship. I mean, and talked about wanting to have kind of a common destiny. Whether or not one thinks, Russia and NATO per se would have worked, the critical thing to my mind was, number one, US and Europeans made a lot of assurances to Russia that NATO would not be expanded. Lots of them. And some of them turned up even after the war. I mean, the war was going on and like something turned up in the British archives, and there was some like a German diplomatic memo saying, well, yeah, we did promise them that we wouldn't go past the Oder, so maybe we should.
What about with what was that when with Gorbachev and James Baker back, I think it was February 9th, 1990, they had that conversation that we won't go anywhere past. That's just something that no one even discusses anymore.
And there were multitudes of those. I mean, we have US diplomatic notes, in the 90s and into the 2000s saying, Russian foreign minister, again, very upset over, I mean, this was routine. And, the 2008 promise to bring in the, into NATO, Georgia and Ukraine, I think was very, very important. In 2007, Putin gave his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference. Again, very worth reading. I mean, look, he's a nasty guy. This is not, in no way do I have anything nice to say about this man, but he's not stupid. And the speech he gave is, what happened to all these assurances you all guys gave us? This doesn't look friendly to us. And he just, if you listen to that, you think, maybe we should be careful here. And you throw on top of that, Serbia mattered. Serbia has historic interest to Russia. I mean, one reason we got World War I is the Russian Empire backed up Serbia, which had committed, an act of state terrorism against Austria-Hungary. I mean, the point is, the Russians really felt the West had done everything it could to kind of just destroy a Russian interest in the Balkans and push them out. The way the Russians got involved was they rushed troops from Bosnia to Pristina, and they had to drive overland because they couldn't fly because nobody would give them permission to fly. I mean, that actually had an impact on popular opinion. Then you throw in the color revolutions. The question is not whether the Russian analysis of everything is right, but their perception matters. And so to my mind, we got along 2014 from a Russian standpoint. The US and Europeans help a street putsch, which is basically staged by the independence, Western-oriented Ukrainians against the pro-Russian Ukrainians. And, they lost. They had the elected guy. They'd won the election. Everybody said basically fairly. So all of that, I think, has come together if we hadn't done that, I think the world would have looked very different. And my guess is Putin would not have done what he did. I don't think that he would have gone in 2014 in Donbass and Crimea. Still doesn't mean that there wouldn't have been difficulties. What's the long-term outlook? But I would say we should look at that and recognize how important it is how the other side views what we do. And I'll just close with, I tell everyone, if the Russians did to the US what the US did to the Russians, there would have been war. If the Russians had an alliance in South America, the Russians staged a coup d'etat in Mexico City and brought to power against a pro-American elected leader their person, if they invited Mexico to join their alliance, people in Washington would be freaking out. They'd be talking about drums of war. They'd be demanding action because we wouldn't accept that. I mean, that's all the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, we run around and say we don't like spheres of influence, and then John Bolton goes and talks about Venezuela and the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is sphere of influence. We rule. That's what the Monroe Doctrine means. So doesn't mean none of this justifies the attack. I mean, I just want to make
right. Of course. You make it clear in your writing. You make it clear in your writing too that you're not justifying the attack.
Exactly. I mean, I just don't want anyone to think in any way that I think what Putin did.
Right. That definitely doesn't come across anyone who writes you.
I'm glad to hear that. But I mean, to me, the critical thing is to me, this is with China for the future. We've got to understand how the other side sees us and how it affects their policy. And I'm afraid that we may very well have lost an opportunity in Russia. I mean, I don't blame us. It's on Putin. But in the future, we need, I don't want war. So we've really got to do better at this, I think.
Well, Doug Bandow from the Cato Institute, thank you so much for taking some time today to discuss Ukraine. It's a very complicated issue, but you really distilled it in a way that I think it's going to be very beneficial for people who see this, to get a little bit of an other side that you might not always hear in the media today. So I am greatly appreciative of you joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a good fun.
And I also would recommend all of you watching to check out trendsresearch.com and subscribe to the Trends Journal. It's history before it happens. Been around for a very long time, and Gerald Salenti is the publisher, and we would love for you to check us out.